I want to start by acknowledging that the University of Colorado sits upon the land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Further, I acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up what is now the state of Colorado. I think that is a good and appropriate way to begin our sessions here as we've started this tradition. So I have the pleasure of getting to introduce to you, if you don't already know him, Dr. Hunter Vaughan, who is officially a scholar in residence within the College of Media, Communication, and Information, CMCI, but hopefully will be with us for quite a bit longer. We'll see how things go. He's a cultural historian. He's an environmental media scholar. We've been in touch and having fun having these conversations about intersections with our work. His recent book, though, I do want to promote to you all to check out. It's called Hollywood's Dirtiest Secret, The Hidden Environmental Costs of the Movies. And so it just came out last year with Columbia University Press. Really fascinating. I've been digging through it. It's been super interesting, so please do check it out. He's also co-editor of a new journal, Environmental Media.
Journal of Environmental
Journal
Media.
of Environmental Media. I know I started to get a little
You need to
bit
get the title right.
self-conscious
You're
about
on the
it because I
editorial
did
board.
the management. I tweeted about it because I was excited and actually contributed to the first issue. And I wrote in my tweet, Journal of Environmental Management. I've been sort of self-conscious ever since. Yeah. So Journal of Environmental Media, please check it out. It's really cool. Lots of great stuff going on. And that is where I'm going to leave this introduction. I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Sounds good.
Have a great conversation here. So
Great.
Thank you for coming along, Hunter.
Thanks, Max, and thanks all of you for coming. I feel awkward standing like I'm lecturing, but it also means I can see all of your faces. I might at some point just give up and sit down, I think. But yeah, thanks, Max, for the invitation to be here and the introduction, and thanks to Amy for helping to organize it and reminding me that I was supposed to send stuff at different times. It was helpful. Planning this talk and sort of leading up to it gave me a great chance to think about sort of where my research is going right now, but also to think on a wider level about the title and what the title entails, because I originally was just going to talk about my book and do something more related to that, and then thought I would take another step forward and see if I could step into more exploratory grounds. And when it might have been a typo, I might have sent the wrong title or something, but I realized when I was thinking about it, I was like, yeah, materiality of the virtual, digital technology and the climate crisis. That's it. It's an affirmative point that there is a relationship between these things, but then when I got the flyer for this event that you sent out, I realized that there was actually a question mark at the end of it, and so it gave me a chance to sort of retrace my steps and think about it more as an actual question, and think about it, which really led to some new constellations of the connection really between this problem of materiality and virtuality, and how digital technology is both helping us sort of address issues of the climate crisis, helping us organize global environmental justice movements, helping us maybe understand climate science better and communicate it better, but it's also playing into this gradual move whereby we are bifurcating our existence between this ontological reality that we're sharing right now, the 10 of us or whatever in this room in real time, and the virtual existence that we are also leading. And some of you might even have your phones out right now. I think that we're being webcast on the internet. I'm definitely using a presentation that was made from photographs and slides and things taken from the internet. And this is something that I come from very much from the humanities and philosophy and ethics of visual culture, and so this is something that's really troubled me as I move more towards environmental media and environmental communication, is how the philosophical, social, and psychological challenges of virtuality and of digital culture have these repercussions in our engagement with and our understanding of and our sense of connectedness to the natural world or to the non-human natural world. So these are some of the, like, that was a list of random answers to this question that I guess I'll be moseying through in the next half hour, but I look forward to getting to a point where it's more of a conversation and discussion, because I'm curious about what y'all think about how invested you are in digital culture and whether or not you do think that it is a positive or negative or simply a contradictory and an ambivalent addition to the human impact on the global environment. Now, for me, the focus on the materiality of the virtual and of visual culture really relates back to a notion of materiality in sort of an environmental studies sense of resource use, and ways in which the infrastructure and the daily practice of digital culture, whether it's using tablets or laptops or phones or streaming devices, or even going to the cinema now, which is largely a digital venture, is actually, not existing in this ethereal realm or on a cloud as the tech industries manage to delude us or trick us into thinking, but it's actually part of this extremely material global network that itself is largely feeding into a sort of colonialism of precious metal mining, labor exploitation, like snaking the seafloors with fiber optic cables, circling the planet with satellites, storing everything in server farms, and then outsourcing e-waste all around the world. And so I feel like, we have this amazing moment where this is really technological, if it's not a technological revolution, it is a technological, what can we call it? Like, it's a major shift that we haven't really experienced the likes of in maybe 500 years or so as a species, probably since the printing press. And it is radically changing both the way that we interact with each other, but also it's changing the very, like, the actual material nature of the earth. We are littering it with plastics and metals. We are wiring it literally with cables. We are connecting it to a global network of machine-to-machine sensors that are changing flows of water, that are changing agricultural practices, that are, have really, really material, concrete impacts, even though we think of them as just like being beamed in the sky to our devices. So this is the focus of most of my research in this field. To give you a bit of background, Max introduced me. I thought it would help to sort of give you an idea more of where I'm coming from. So this is the book that I came out with this past year, and it's an environmental counter-narrative to Hollywood history that retraces the steps of some of Hollywood's major films like Gone with the Wind, Singing in the Rain, up to Avatar, and uses these case studies as a way to look at a variety of ways in which mainstream visual cultural practices both, are dependent on natural resource use, disrupt ecosystems, and also sort of perpetuate certain anthropocentric views that the world is our oyster to be cracked open and gobbled up. Recently, the book, which is largely a cinema history, does move more towards an attempt to bridge environmental humanities with environmental communication, which is what the journal is sets out to do. And I think that that's something that's happening increasingly today, is that these divided disciplines, these divided fields, which historically have been divided in some ways through like territorialism, in some ways through funding dynamics at universities, in some ways through disciplinary and methodological disagreement or disparity, are now starting to move towards each other, and they're being pushed towards each other by these two defining paradigms of the 21st century. One of them being the ubiquity of digital media, and that digital media is starting to permeate not only the practice of disciplines, but also we cannot ignore the fact that it is shaping our almost every interaction in daily life, but also, secondly, the prominence of environmental issues and especially climate change. The urgency, the growing urgency and enormity of climate change threats, which basically is finally forcing, I think, nearly every academic discipline to realize that environmental studies is relevant to everything and should be sort of a topic that is addressed in every field of thought. So these two dominant paradigms, I think, are really pushing a lot of different disciplines towards a sort of conjunction or into conversation, which they were not previously. As I mentioned, I come very much from a background of the philosophy and ethics of visual culture. My doctoral research in my first book is all about ways in which moving image form can shape our worldviews and change our perceptions of each other, shape the way that we create memory, access memory, produce history. And I started thinking about this more so connected specifically to our perceptions of the environment. And while I was finishing my PhD, I stumbled upon this a film shoot in Oxford in one of the colleges, and it was just so bizarre, like in this very quaint medieval English town in the Sainte Croix of one of these colleges. I think, Max, you might have actually been in Oxford at this time. There's just like this throbbing glow of artificial light. And I peeked my head in, and it was just all this like metal scaffolding and rubber cords and cables and electric cords, and these power generators were humming, and this light was just glowing. There's so much artificiality, and I asked one of the crew members what they were doing. He said they were doing a run through for the next day's shoot. And from like I went to USC. I worked at 20th Century Fox while I was there. Like I wasn't in awe of Hollywood in action, but my mind was actually blown by just the excess and the waste and the energy dependency and kind of the nonchalant, taken for grantedness of all of that was feeding into that production. And so that led to this 10-year study that finally I was managed to publish last year. While I was doing this, while I was making this transition largely from, I would say, a sort of, I call it the ethics of visual culture, maybe cultural history, film studies, and philosophy, while I was transitioning more to look specifically through an environmental lens at cultural practice, there was this other major transition happening in the world through which digital film practice was actually becoming the predominant form of the way that we make movies, which became, I think, reached its pinnacle with Avatar in 2009, which marketed itself as the first fully digital film ever made, which is ironic because it's actually very much shot in an analog fashion. It just ended up getting churned through some dozens of terabytes of digital information, which themselves were being passed among these CGI houses in the US, Canada, France, and New Zealand. Again, not being floated there on clouds, right, but actually being transmitted mostly through fiber optic cables, which carries 98% of our global digital information around the world. These fiber optic cables that are starting to erode along the ocean floors and have completely changed entire island communities and specific cultures. I have a colleague, Nicole Staroselsky, who wrote a book called The Undersea Network, which is a really excellent study of that. So for me, the book really leads up to this major question. It's not just about Hollywood as this icon and index of American capitalism, and it's not just about the excesses and the natural or the environmental impacts of Hollywood, but specifically how Hollywood encapsulates this turn to a digital culture, and what we think of as living in a sort of virtual realm that both detaches us from the material but also demands a lot of material resources and creates a lot of material impacts. Now, during this time also, you all might have noticed, we had this dramatic shift in the way that we view things. So not just the way that we make things, but the way that we view them, where the sort of 20th century dominant mode of going to the cinema was replaced in the second half of the 20th century by television, and then by digital screens. And digital screens now are pretty much everywhere we go, right? Like they're in airports, they're in school buildings, they are in museums. I can't really think of anywhere actually where they aren't at this point. And they are advertising things, they are giving information. Some of it is helpful, some of it is harmful, some of it is just pointless and a total waste of energy, money, and time. But such is American capitalism. All of this sort of arrived at what media theorists, I don't know, if, are any of you, or most of you from environmental studies? Any of you from media studies? No?
I don't teach some media studies.
Some? Are y'all familiar with the notion of convergence culture? So convergence culture is a new media theory, or a theory of new media, which looks specifically at the computer or the connected internet device as having challenged the historical specificity, uniqueness, and separation of different forms of cultural media or artistic practice. So like back in the 1700s during the Enlightenment, which was all about taxonomy and categorization and laying out the world in specific boxes so we could understand it and so that rich white men could consume it and make money off it. There were these strong notions that artistic forms had medium specificity, right? Sculpture did a certain thing with certain tools. Painting did a certain thing with certain tools. Music did a certain thing with certain tools. And they should all be kept separate, and they should all do what they did best, and just that, and not tread on each other's toes. But then we created or invented this object, or Alan Turing invented this object, and then apparently Al Gore invented the internet that would connect all of these Turing machines. And this gave us the ability to reduce all of those previously separate forms into one binary code and to converge them into this one box where they all became sort of the raw materials for a new media that was producing things as a bricolage of all of these old forms. And this is, I mentioned this media theory or this notion of convergence culture because it is, I think it feeds into this notion, this way in which computing technology and connectedness has allowed us to transform material actions and objects into these virtual data components, which we then forget actually have a material life and had a material source, and will actually probably have a material death and have a material decomposition somewhere, who knows where. Things get very, very odd places in the digital age. Did y'all hear about the E.T. video game burial? No?
Like thousands of them made because it was such a bad game or something.
Yeah, so
and it became super rare.
It was a really early Atari game. It was a total flop. It was.
I used to have it.
Did you?
Yeah.
I've never
I
met
swear,
someone that
I
had the
remember
E.T.
you
video
used to
game.
go and find these little Reese's Pieces. I remember it.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
So it was like an epic failure, and the video game maker wanted to cover their failure, and so they doctored their books, and under cover of night, they loaded 3 massive shipping trucks or dump trucks with these cartridges and took them out into like the middle of the Texan desert and buried them. And this was unearthed maybe 2 years ago. They were buried for something like 25 years, and then it was unearthed. Yeah, it's crazy. And so when people talk, there's a popular reference to this notion of media archaeology these days, which I have problems with because archaeology is a very specific field. But there are ways in which we are literally changing the composition of soil and of ecosystems simply by burying our digital rubbish, what Jennifer Gaffries calls digital rubbish inside of it. And ET cartridges are a prominent factor in this. Anyway, I digress. So convergence culture, for me, is part of a much larger, or a term for what goes on within this device, but it's part of a larger sort of social activity or behavior that I call server screen culture, Any Pokemon Go players?
It
Yeah?
used to
I've
be.
done it.
Yeah. I didn't know what it was. I was out of the country for a summer. I came back and all these people were outside on the sidewalk, and which was nice. I was like, oh, people are out and about. They're experiencing nature, and they're all in groups and interacting. And as I got closer to them, I realized that none of them were interacting with each other. They weren't talking to each other, and they're all just staring at their phones and just sort of walking like in random circles. It was fascinating. So from like our sort of daily, I guess, leisurely pursuits to the mainstays of education, to the front lines of social justice movements, this same server screen culture, this culture of digital devices, of cell phones connected to laptops, connected to networks, connected to other people's cell phones. It is central to it, and as Max has written about quite a lot. This new media component has also determined ways in which we communicate and engage people on issues of climate change and environmental problems. I don't know if y'all have seen An Inconvenient Truth, but films like An Inconvenient Truth and Racing Extinction and Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral I find remarkable because while they are these stories of like environmental instability, there are also these narratives of white men fighting to overcome technology and figure out how to use cameras, digital cameras, and laptops to make presentations about climate change. It's a really interesting narrative arc that runs parallel to the climate change story that they're telling. Up to, for me, the most sort of recent explosion of ways in which this server screen culture engaged with environmental communication was the manipulation, use, exploitation, and just sort of hot potato of Greta Thunberg's likeness on social media, either Instagram or Twitter, where alternately conservatives or climate change deniers or climate change alarmists would use her face and then convert it into different things to show her either as like this angel that they're martyring in the name of global environmental justice, or as some sort of like satanic figure who's misleading everyone. I saw there was a big story in the Washington Post yesterday. Apparently, the Heartland Institute has found a reactionary German teen who is as anti-climate change as she is anti-immigration. What's that?
I saw that.
Yeah, now they're
Naomi something.
The Wash Post was like the anti-Greta.
the anti-Greta is how it's being pitched. Yeah, so now there's like this bizarre stardom, like teen stardom around climate change activism that has escalated to this point of like a grudge match or cage match, and the cage is the internet. All of this, server screen culture, this notion of server screen culture can be positioned within a wider, I would say a wider field addressing the social, psychological, and social and psychological impacts of digital technology and of our interactions with our phones and computers. I don't know if y'all are familiar with any of these. I really, these are three of my favorite studies. Adam Alter looks at ways in which technological companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, how these companies actually pay crazy amounts of money in order to get people who are trained in understanding the psychological mechanics of behavioral addiction. And then they can write up code and algorithms that actually manufacture behavioral addiction in users. And that's why we go back to Twitter or Facebook every 15 minutes and refresh, is that they're actually using understood theories in psychology of behavioral addiction to make us do that. Incidentally, none of those people, of the CEOs who get rich off of this, let their children use their devices because they know what they're doing. Nicholas Carr's The Shallows is a great study of neurobiology, looking at ways in which internet use is actually rewiring our brains. Our brains, they're in flux constantly, and they're kind of like squishy clay, and we mold them every day, and we mold them through what we do. And for hundreds of years, we molded them by sitting down alone with books and reading them. and we would engage with this deep experience of mental activity that created neurological networks that were connected to the formation of deep memory, as well as the capacity for empathy with other people. So what we're doing now, by forsaking that, doing away with that, and moving to this sort of scan, multi-window neural network formation, is that we're becoming really good at multitasking, and we're becoming really good at short-term problem management, but we are becoming really bad. We're literally wiring, on an evolutionary level, we're wiring out of our species the capacity for empathy. So yeah, think about that next time. Like try to read a book for 5 minutes. That's what he did. Is he was an early laptop user. I think he worked for like Encyclopedia Britannica or something, and he started realizing that he couldn't sit down and read books for more than 5 minutes anymore without being distracted or bored or something, and he was troubled by that. And that's what's happening. Whereas Sherry Turkle looks at our interaction with cyborgs and robotics and virtual life in terms that this great phrase she uses, which is alone together, in a way that we are, now we actually spend time in rooms together, but we're alone. We're actually separate from each other and not interacting. And so I find that like my research on this definitely coincides with these works more in the social sciences on the impacts of digital technology use, as well as a rising interest and concern for the material nature of our digital culture. Anything from cinema to internet use, etc. All of this sort of reaches a fever pitch or critical mass today in what we refer to as the Internet of Things. Do y'all know this term? Yeah?
Yeah.
Do y'all engage with the Internet of Things? I mean, we're engaging with it right now to some degree, but I don't know, do any of you use things like Nest at home to control your thermostat from afar? Or I think Nest also has, Nest and Amazon teamed up for something where you can like open your door for people. But basically, the Internet of Things refers to everything from this very like household level of ways in which all of our appliances are increasingly connected to the internet and we can control them from our phones, to ways in which this is spread out across a society, to ways in which this is spread out across the entire globe. And most studies show this exponential rise as we become more connected with the number of gadgets or devices that are going to be connected to the internet. But not just that, the amount of energy that will be used by the internet. And so between by 2025, they're calculating that 20% of global energy dependency and use will be based on digital or internet connected activities. And we still only have about 20% of our energy coming from renewable sources. Most of it is still dirty coal, which means that this massive exponential rise is itself going to have a huge energy footprint and greenhouse gas emissions because of that. I have all kinds of statistics here that it'll take me too long to read, but I don't know if y'all are reading about 3G. So we had at first we had wired internet, and then we had 3G wireless internet, which used 15 times the amount of energy as wired internet just to run the same basic technologies. Compared to that, 4G uses 23 times the amount that 3G Wi-Fi did. And I don't know if any of you have seen, but 5G is already advertising itself and convincing us that it's going to save the world. Have y'all read any of the proclamations or declarations of 5G's arrival?
Just my friend who thinks it's a mind control device.
Mind control device? Yeah, probably
I
is.
think Boulder City Council actually, one of the members had circulated some video that proved to be a bit irresponsible and speculating about what 5G will do for Boulder and beyond.
Yes, and the 5G, the argument of 5G is that we're going to move from a kind of user Internet of Things to a largely machine-to-machine connected Internet of Things, where we have sensors set up all around cities, all around ecosystems that are interacting with each other. We're superfluous by this point, really. If the planet is lucky, then the great singularity will happen, and artificial intelligence will realize that the most efficient thing it can do for the planet is to get rid of us, and then maybe the machine-to-machine communication can just go about its merry way, and the rest of the species will not go extinct. I know it's happy. By 2022, this machine-to-machine technology and connectedness is going to be demanding up to like 45% more energy use than our human internet connectedness is demanding now. And they're having to create these new like multi-sensor node semiconductors, which itself requires 6 times the manufacturing resources. So all of this to say that as our devices get smaller and as the production and maintenance and archiving of our online seemingly infinite archiving and information gets more invisible and becomes more virtual, and we interact with it on a more virtual level, the actual material impact of it is getting bigger and deeper. All of it is, of course, kept out of the way where we can't see it on server farms all across the world. Luckily, a lot of tech companies are realizing the energy demands or dependency of server culture, and are actually, I know that Apple, I believe, has started to basically circle their server farms with solar farms, and I believe have gone completely renewable in that all of their server functions. So, I mean, this is, their Apple server farms is where, like, each of us using Apple Maps, or does anyone use Apple Maps? I don't know if anyone uses that. Maybe they use iTunes, whatever, Apple apps you use, all of that data is being stored there. And depending on how they power their servers, that is our footprint as digital culture users. So again, I just keep coming back to the same question: is the digital revolution a green revolution? And if you look at, despite the fact that I do believe that there are positives to this, and I don't think it's like totally negative. We can't see it as totally negative, otherwise it would just be this horribly hopeless endeavor to exist with it. But we do need to understand that from the environmentally disruptive and irresponsible mining of precious metals that go into all of our devices, to the sweatshop labor practices that then convert those into final goods, to the digital dumping grounds where where the U.S. outsources most of its digital waste. All of this is connected to a very deep materiality, even if we exist through these devices in many ways as virtual global citizens. Now, the history of the environmental movement revolves around different ways of rendering visible the hidden hazards and hidden problems of environmental change, and what Rob Nixon calls the slow violence of environmental destruction. And so there are also ways in which digital technology is really providing us with some excellent tools for things like data visualization, for the visualization of global warming. Also, taking some of the attitudes of street art and art activism and we're starting to see that sort of bleed over into social media, environmental activism, and the emergence of augmented and virtual reality are actually possibly providing us with new captivating ways to engage with the natural world. Now, holding a phone up in front of a decimated landscape and seeing what it might have looked like 100 years ago before there's a factory 20 miles from it is either horribly upsetting or perhaps inspiring for change. And so we see this way in which digital culture is really permeating into the worlds of environmental activism and environmental media, whether it's through, museums, heritage sites, nonprofits, advocacy campaigns. All of this is tied to the same Internet of Things that is requiring all of this energy, and that is built on the shoulders of global, labor exploitation and environmental destruction. I'm really curious at this point about where virtual and augmented reality take us. Thanks. Have any of you played with Oculus or what was it used for when you?
Oh, a few things. There was a few in the high quality video range, like on the left, flying around Google Earth and
Oh yeah.
being chased by a Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was a game changer.
Yeah.
This actually was at Ben Hale's house.
That's actually an image, a marketing image from Magic Leap, which is a company from South Florida that's been under the radar for like 10 years, spending hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to develop this technology. And I think it's about to just explode into every,
Game changer.
yeah. And in some, like a lot of what I've seen them do like a 2-hour pitch for what they do. And ultimately, it allows you to have like a little gnome run around your living room and interact with magazines on your coffee table. To me, that's not really worth hundreds of millions of dollars and the incredible like resource costs of it, but it's also being developed for new approaches to PTSD therapy and to allowing people who are hospitalized a sense of sensory access to nature. And so it remains to be seen how it's going to be used predominantly and how that's going to craft social behaviors. But it's curious. I am curious definitely to see how it's used, especially for environmental advocacy, environmental communication, engagement and outreach, but also what the next set of numbers are regarding how it has transformed our practices in resource mining and the energy dependency of digital culture. So again, back to this question of digital technology and the climate crisis, in ways it's feeding into it and in ways it's maybe helping us to either ameliorate the situation or at least to find new ways to communicate and to engage people that in ways that on an analog level in ontological reality can actually lead to actual change. For me, where that leads really is in two directions. One of them being to focus on environmental communication studies, the efficacy, especially of short form spreadable environmental messaging, which is becoming the most popular way that environmental communication is happening, and the way in which people are engaging with it, because people like to watch short videos and they like to be able to share them with people. And that's what the spreadable side of it is. And so how is the spreadable aspect and the short form specificity of this new form of environmental communication altering and shaping the actual messaging strategies and environmental perceptions of users, but also trying to find ways to push technological industries and culture industries like mainstream film into, and advertising, for example, into more environmentally conscientious practices. So yeah, that's me, and thank you for coming, and please contact me if you would like to follow up on any of these various lines of inquiry or discussion. But now I'd love to hear what your thoughts on this are, and whether or not you actually want to just throw all of our computers out the window right now and go sit in a field. Yeah.
I mean, I already did. But
nice. Well done.
One thing kind of right at the very end, talking about the kind of short form, and I'm curious to get your kind of take on some of the longer form bits of media that are extremely prevalent. I mean, thinking of kind of long form podcasts and the explosion of the number of podcasts,
Mhm.
sharing and listening to them, and the amount of listeners. I also think of like long form YouTube videos that like YouTube, for instance, like the way it monetizes the videos is it kind of tracks how long people are watching, and so a lot of the content creators on there are responding by making longer and longer videos. And I'm curious how those kind of that strain of new media consumption in a way could be kind of wielded towards, or if you've seen it wielded towards, say, environmental communication. I like connect to my own experiences of being out in nature and appreciating the kind of slowing down and kind of long temporality of it versus like the kind of bustle and constant kind of craziness of dealing with a lot of other kind of parts of life.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned the word slow. I was reading an Atlantic Monthly, it's like an op-ed on sloth, on this notion that it is very detrimental both to the social fabric and also to the environmental impact of cultural practice. The fact that there's not more friction in our digital behaviors, the fact that you send things immediately and you never think about them again, and you don't have to hold yourself accountable, or the fact that Netflix automatically starts the next episode of something. I think that it would benefit everything to introduce friction to things like YouTube or Netflix, and Twitter, and like all of it. That's not quite what you're asking, but it made me think of that. YouTube has become a hotbed for environmental debate. And it has, like as soon as like the BP oil spill happened, BP launched its YouTube channel. The same thing has happened for pretty much every major oil company that has been responsible for like an environmental disaster. As soon as it happens, they launch a YouTube channel. At the same time, there are these massive inundations. I'm right now doing like a study of short form sea level rise video messaging specifically on YouTube. And YouTube seems to be the place to go now for like environmental PSA announcements. There is definitely a relative democratization of distribution. And so I think that a lot of voices that didn't previously have agency now have agency because of sites like YouTube, and even because of like content production models like you see at Netflix and Hulu. I mean, if you look at the actual content that's produced by Netflix, it is radically progressive compared to like mainstream studio or network stuff. And it's because they work outside of those distribution models, and they're investing their trust in the agency of like queer voices, women voices, non-heteronormative voices, voices of color, and they're producing some really, really amazing stuff. And so I do like, is your question sort of about the democratization of voices, or?
I mean, that's one way to take it. I mean, the kind of mentioning, I wonder if like, I guess I call into question, or I'm kind of motivated by the question that like a lot of people, I've heard a lot of people assert that like, or at least make the argument that media consumption now is kind of shrinking our attention span. We're preferring, these are like kind of stating them as truisms, right? Not to say that there isn't empirical evidence to support some of these claims at least, but to say that, oh, it's shorting our attention spans, we're preferring shorter and shorter content, yet some of the longer form content is kind of exploding in popularity. And so there seems to be some kind of tension there between kind of what is that serving in terms of our own kind of satisfaction for media, and I could see it kind of aligning, and why I was motivated with the question is because I could see that kind of explosion in popularity of longer form kind of materials also aligning with kind of some kind of personal motivations of environmental experience and environmental communication that like I'm wondering if there's some kind of congruency.
Yeah, and I mean, on one hand, I would say like there's room enough for everyone, or there's room enough for all lengths of content, and that's kind of a problem really with the openness of things like YouTube, is that it is facilitating this massive multiplication of content production, and content production doesn't come from nowhere. I have noticed that, for example, with my students who introduced me to TikTok last semester, which is like ultra short form, even shorter form than YouTube short form, which is usually like 2 to 4 minutes or maybe 90 seconds at the shortest, that they still like feature films. They still like watching 2-hour things. They still like the construction of complex narrative, but I do also think that it's a really interesting generational shift, and I think that anyone in the environmental movement or in environmental communication acknowledges by this point that it's not a question of science, that there's a total scientific consensus. We don't even really need to convince people that climate change is happening. It just requires a massive shift in cultural values and in cultural norms. And that is a thing that happens generationally. And so if the generation, that is emerging into adulthood can be engaged on both, I would say both forum fronts, then that would be ideal, because I do think that there is, at least among my students now, I've been teaching for just over 10 years maybe, and I already see a radical change in the sort of awareness of environmental issues, a sense of passion or at least engagement with climate change as a problem. I don't know, do y'all feel the same way? Maybe you don't, maybe, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Where I was gonna leave with my question, because it relates so much, is what have you seen around polarization and depolarization in these spaces with the new media and the convergence? Because the class I'm teaching is deeply related to that. And
well, I think that this thing, the Heartland Institute's anti-Greta and this weird exploitation of teen women, like, however beneficial it might be, for example, to champion Greta Thunberg as this global activist who should inspire both other teenagers and adults, it is exploitation of teenage women. Like, it's very bizarre. It's very troubling, and especially the Heartland Institute's version of it. So that, to me, that was a perfect example of that divisiveness. When you mentioned YouTube, I was also thinking of the fact that when this big story broke, that when Greta Thunberg came to the U.S. with that very much almost, it was like Beatlemania level of announcing her first visit to the U.S., and she was giving these talks in Central Park and stuff. And when she had her big talk in Central Park lined up, the YouTube algorithms were putting at the top of viewer lists climate denial videos. And so there's this weird way in which actual social media or online content algorithms were providing a conservative counterpoint to a sort of in-person collective environmental moment. I would say the divisiveness is extremely real. And it's just a louder or more mediated version of divisiveness that's happening in general.
So if I may build on that, so with, not to be in a technological determinist stance, but there is this momentum here of a no going back. So given what you're
techno-fatalistic stance?
Yeah, well, even though actually I see an interesting pattern among undergraduates of getting off all social media.
Mm-hmm.
In my media class, the amount of said that I'm totally off these things now, I don't want to use them anymore. I was like, wow, that's kind of amazing. But so there's a little bit of that pushback, but we have this huge momentum. It's happening. we have this divisiveness and polarization occurring, what would you say, what do we do with it? What do we do with that? How do we navigate? Just a small question.
Yeah, no pressure. How do we navigate it? I think that some of the solutions that I think are most important and would be most effective are kind of out of many of our hands, except for who we vote for. I think that, for example, people like Mark Zuckerberg need to be held accountable for the political impacts of their technologies and their interfaces, and they need to be held accountable for policy changes that might not benefit them financially, but benefit or lessen the social destruction and political divisiveness and misinformation that's provided on their platforms. The stance that Zuckerberg takes, his sort of nonchalant dismissiveness of political integrity, like I honestly think that he is up there with Trump in terms of the actual danger and undermining of institutions of democracy, of our political integrity, and of our social decency. And so I think that we need to elect people that will actually hold corporate figures and corporations accountable for both the way in which their communication systems are managed, but also the ways in which their companies have environmental impact. It took a UN report on coltan mining in the Congo to basically shame companies like Apple to try to look for this precious metal elsewhere. But they had already spent a decade or more getting rich off of forced child labor on behalf of like paramilitary groups, and their money was then being funneled around Central Africa, fueling these guerrilla civil wars. And they got rich off. I mean, a lot of like the major digital tech companies were built off of getting coltan from that source. That needs to be held accountable. We need to, as cultural users, I think we need to hold our culture industries accountable. I think Hollywood needs to be held accountable. Now, there are different ways in which that can happen. We can do that through our consumer choices, but then that's kind of like this techno-fetishistic green consumer notion that we can fix everything by switching to LED light bulbs, which I don't agree with, and I think is a way in which the last like 3 decades of green consumerism has misled us down a path that's perpetuated business as usual. I personally can't, I would love to. I can't walk into a major like corporate office or into a Hollywood studio and wag my finger and force people to be more environmentally conscientious. So it's a matter, I think, of collective action, of maybe using social media really as a megaphone for cultural change, but also as a megaphone for cultural shaming. I really think that industries like Hollywood care a lot about their public image, and they might be coerced simply based on protecting that image. But yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of it has to do with accountability. It's a tough thing to argue in this country, though, where we are, our antitrust laws are almost just like ground to dirt, and there's no there's no holding accountable of people for practices that are socially or politically divisive or environmentally destructive. There are far more so in countries, especially like Northern European countries and even Canada, where they have more of a mix of capitalistic economic models and socialistic social policies and political structures. So yeah, change capitalism. That's Naomi Klein's argument, and this changes everything. And to a degree, she's right, and it's an absurdly large demand, but it really would require massive shifts in how we perceive and practice capitalism.
Well, we've just about run ourselves out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Vaughan.
Thanks for coming. And thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thank you all for coming along. We've got 3 talks remaining.